Hello, hello. Welcome to your 7th lesson in Python. Today we're going to talk about input and output. So at this stage of the game, you've already seen some input and output. You've used the input function to get information from a user, and you used the print function to display information to a user. Today we're going to read and write from files. The general process for reading or writing from a file is to first open the file, then read, write, or append, whichever operation you need to perform, and then close the file. So the open function is pretty straightforward. It takes two main parameters, the file path and the access mode. By default, if you don't include the access mode, we will be reading from every file, but it's always good to include the access mode. On the right are some of the different access modes, R for read or B for read binary. We'll get into that when we see code examples. The file path is something like your text file name or the file name or the exact directory that you want to open a file at. And we have F to catch the file object that gets returned by the open function. Just to give you an idea of what some of the access modes do, I've included this table here. This is not something that we're going to go into with much detail, but it's good to have if you ever want to refer back and see, okay, what does R do exactly? What does W do exactly? And there's some fun ones like X, which opens for exclusive creation. So some of the important functions that can be done by the file object. So once you've opened a file and you have that file object there, you can read from a file, you can read a line, you can write to a file, you can move to a specific position, you can figure out what position you're at, and you can close the file. Alright, so let's get into some coding. This is going to be a fun lesson. We're going to read from a file, we're going to write to a file, and then we're going to modify an already existing file. So I'm going to try and teach this lecture a little bit different. Instead of switching back between the PowerPoint and the code, I'm just going to stay in the code for the rest of the lecture. So we just learned about the open function, which is commonly used with two arguments. We have the file name and the access mode. The file name is required. The access mode is optional. By default, it's read, but for the most part, you're going to add an access mode. So let's go ahead and say we're going to read from a file, and the file is called test.txt. So the open function also returns a file object, so let's catch that file object in a variable called f. Now, good practice when programming is anytime you open a file, you're going to immediately write your close. The close will be at the bottom of your code, and in between you're going to do your write, read, and append. But it's a good practice just to throw that in there now so you don't forget to close it. So let's go ahead and run this program and see what happens. So right away we're going to get an error called file not found, and that's because when you're reading from a file, you're never going to create it. You're just going to check, does it exist? If not, throw an error. If it does, alright, let's read from it. So to solve that, let's create a file called test.txt here. Then when we run this program, everything's good to go. So let's go ahead and write some stuff in here. Hello, 1, 2, 3, hello. So back in our main program, we want to start reading from the file. And the way we do that is just f read line, and let's print that out to the user. So we'll go ahead and run that, and we get hello. So if we read line again and print it, we're going to get the next line in the document. The file object f keeps track of where it's at, and you can always check that by printing f.tell. So tell is a function that'll display its current position in the file. We're currently at position number 9. There's one more function that's just worth showing off at this point, is you can go to a specific point in the file. Let's say we want to go back to the beginning. We can seek to position 0, and then we'll read the line again. We're going to get hello, 1, 9, hello. All right, hello, 1, 9, move to 0, and we get hello again. I didn't need to print the seek. Hello, 1, 9, hello. You might be thinking, wow, that's awfully inefficient. Every time you want to read a new line, you have to call the function readLine. And in practice, we're not going to do that. We're going to use an iterator to just go through the entire file at once. And the way we do something like that is for line in f. So for every line that we find in the file object, we're just going to print it out. Print line, and we're going to add a separator of, let's say, a new line character. So for every line in f, print that line with a new line. And we indeed get hello, 1, 2, 3, hello. So let's go ahead and add something to the end of the file just to verify that works. Let's throw a 4 in there and run that again. We get hello, 1, 2, 3, hello, 4. So this is a dynamic way of printing every line in the file. Let's say we wanted to add something to the file. We want to write to the file instead of reading. So at the end here, we want to write number 5. So if we're changing from reading to writing, we're going to have to change the access modifier. And it's very common to think that, oh, we're now writing to the file, let's change the access modifier to W. Let's just give it a shot and see what happens. So we're going to write 5. And it does have to be a string for write. So I'm going to switch over to our text file, and let's see what happens. Everything gets erased, but the 5 does get written. So what happens here is when you're writing to a file, it's going to clear the file and get it ready for writing. This is a common mistake, and it can cause a lot of pain if you have information in your text file that you need, as once you write over it, there's no recovering it. So instead, we want to use A for append. So now when we go back to our text file and we run this, we get 5 right at the end, just where we want it. Let's say we wanted to write an entire list at once using an iterator, kind of how we read using an iterator. So let's say we have a list 1, 2, 3. So we could write something like, for item in my list, f.write item. So for every item in the list, let's write it into our file. So let's go ahead and run that and see how it looks. So this is interesting. There's no separator here between 1, 2, and 3, and it doesn't match the style that we previously set. So keep that in mind. When you're writing, you will also have to write what the separator will be afterwards, whether it be a space or a new line. So in this iterating loop, you want to write the item, then you want to write a new line character, so the next item is on its next line. So let's go ahead and press play and look at our test.txt. And now we have 1, 2, 3, just how we want it. All right, so we've read from a file, we've modified a file. What if we wanted to modify a file from the middle? Let's say we wanted to get rid of 1, 2, 3. Well, if we tried to write, we'd get rid of everything. If we tried to append, we'd just go to the end. So how should we go about this? How can we get rid of this line. And I'm kind of showing you this just for fun. This is not something that's required on the homework, but this is a good way to modify a file and change something in the middle of a file, as right now we can only append from the bottom. So what we're going to want to do is create a temporary file, and we're going to name it test.text.temp, and we're going to write to that file. And as always, we're going to close the file as soon as we're done using it. So let's write that close now. So in the middle, we're going to read from F, and if we encounter the line we don't want, we're not going to write it over to temp. Let me show you what I mean in code. So for line in F, if line equals 1, 2, 3 with the new line, because we do add that in, continue. We just don't want to do anything with it. Otherwise, temp.write line. So for every line that's in F, if it's equal to 1, 2, 3, don't write it. Otherwise, write it. And then at the end, close the files. So let's give that a run. And you can see here that an error popped up because I didn't change the access modifier of F. I'm trying to append, and then I'm trying to read from an append access modifier. It's saying, hey, you can't read. So we do have to change that to R. And now it works. If we look at test, and we look at test.text.temp, we did indeed get rid of the 1, 2, 3. And this is the file we want. However, now we have two files. And it's kind of a mess. So a cool trick is to import the operating system functions. So these are functions that allow us to interact with the operating system itself. So before we finish, we're going to say, hey, I want to get rid of test.text, and then I want to rename test.text.temp to test.text. So we're going to get rid of the file with the information that we don't want, and we're going to move the new file, and we're going to rename our new file as the old file. So if we run that, it deletes our test.text.temp, and our text.text no longer has that 1, 2, 3 error. So this one's going to be fun. Again, this is kind of an example that goes out of the scope of your homework, but I think it's good to show you how different things work in Python. So let's say we wanted to read from an image file and then display whatever's in this image file to the screen, or create a new file based on the information in this image file. So we're going to open this file, and we're going to actually use binary to read this image file. So we're going to read binary. It's different than the ones we've seen before. And we're going to want to close it before we continue, and then for line in F, print line. All right, let's give this a run and see what happens. We get this huge file. And this is what your image file actually looks like. So every time you have a PNG file or a JPEG file, you're going to have byte data which makes up the file. Here's what it looks like. Let's say we want to take this and write it to a new file. So we have new equals open known image.png, and we're going to write binary this time. So now instead of printing, we're just going to say, hey, new.write line. And at the end, we're going to want to do new.close. Alright, so if we give this a run, we have our known image that has now been created based on mystery image. And if we give it a click, check it out. This data actually represents an image that you've seen before, which is the CHS seal. Pretty cool. So you can actually read in any type of file as binary, and it will keep its information just fine. All right. Thank you for spending a little bit of your time with me today, learning about input and output in Python. I hope this was a fun lecture, and I hope you learned something. Have a great day.